I'm speaking to an audience I've not spoken to before. User experience audience is new to me. But what is not new to me is studies of the voice. So I come to study the voice from an academic perspective. So I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, which broken down means I'm interested in the mechanisms of thought. And I use neuroscientific methods to look at those as well as behavioral approaches. And I'm interested in how we produce and perceive the human voice. So I hope that maybe there'll be some themes in my research that may be of interest to you in your applied settings using vocal agents. So it would maybe be helpful to think about, from my perspective, what is a voice? How would I define a voice? And so one thing that is true of the human voice is it is an incredibly flexible musical instrument for self-expression. And historically, actually, a lot of the psychology and neuroscience focused on one aspect of it majorly, which is the fact that it can put language into the air, right? Spoken language, and we can understand words and messages from that. And what has received slightly less attention is the possibility to fill these signals with lots of social and affective information and expression of identity. So that's really where my research lies. But just to think about what is a voice, the voice is highly complex. It's a highly complex, dynamic action, very complicated and fluid action. For example, when producing speech. So here's a video of one of my research assistants in an MRI scanner, and you're basically seeing a slice down the middle of his head. And it's a video of only 10 frames a second, but for us this is quite good resolution for what we want to show. And he's just talking in the scanner. And I just draw your attention to, so basically we've got, have I got a laser on here?
Yeah.
Is it in the middle?
In the middle.
Okay, great. So basically we've got in the middle, you're not going to see this, okay. So basically he's pointing this way, right? Nose is here, back of the head is here. And here are his lips. Here's his voice box, the larynx. Here's his tongue. Your tongue is massive. He's not exceptional in this regard. And here is the soft palate at the back of the mouth. And all of these different structures, including jaw movement as well, are changing in a very fluid and highly coordinated manner to speak. So I'll give you just a flavour of that.
This is a video of speech in the MRI scanner. Images are recorded at 10 frames per second. We can track the movements of the articulators, such as the tongue, da, ka, da, ka, the lips, ba, the soft palate, ma, na, na.
Okay, so when you're dealing with voices, whether they be human in origin or not, you're thinking about that kind of complexity. When you're dealing with a human voice interacting with an agent, then you're dealing with this highly variable, highly flexible expression of the self. And if we break that down as psychologists and researchers of the voice, we think about it in a source and filter model. So the source of the voice is here in the throat in your voice box, and you've got vocal cords in there, and they vibrate as air comes up from the lungs. And they're held together, and when they vibrate, they make a buzzing sound. And that buzzing sound becomes the source of speech. So if you were to listen to an example of the source of speech, then it would sound like this. Any guesses as to what that person was saying? This was recorded just from the outside of the throat. Jack and Jill went up the hill. Okay, so actually, even though this doesn't give you the full information from speech as you would hear it in the air, there's a lot of melodic information, rhythmic information that is put into this source sound. And then what happens on top of that then is we move the lips, the tongue, the soft palate, the jaw to filter that sound into speech, song, producing. So it's a highly complex signal. And while you might think, well, there are all sorts of sources of social information in our bodies, right? The way we move, the way we look, and the way we sound. And it might be tempting to think that the voice is like an auditory equivalent of the face, right? We get emotion out of it, we can get identity, we can get speech or other kinds of signals. And yes, you can get those different types of information out, but crucially, a voice is an action, okay? So you need an airflow, and you need to generate that airflow yourself, and you need to make all these movements, you need to control the on and off of the buzz of the sound in the larynx. And if I stop moving all those bits, I don't have a voice anymore. It's gone. It's not there anymore. But if I'm asleep, or in fact, if I'm even dead, I still have a face, right? So it's still there. It still sits there. It's something that is part of my body, my person. And that means that when we think about the voice, when I think about the voice, I think of it as a signal that represents, to some extent, a dynamic agent, because somebody had to move, something had to move to make this happen. And I guess from your perspective, when you hear a voice coming out of any kind of object, then it connotes this sense of dynamism and being alive and having agency. So that's just to sort of leave you with that as how I think about the voice and how the voice is controlled. And we do a lot of research in the lab looking at how, as humans, we put this kind of information into our voice. How do I sound confident? How do I sound approachable? How do I change my voice to imitate a foreign language sound or something like that? And how does our brain control it? But what I thought might be more interesting for you this evening is to think about some of the ways in which we would model and test the perception of the voice and the perception of these qualities in the voices that we might hear coming from other people or other sources. So I'm just going to walk you through a couple of ideas that I've had when thinking about how we interact with voices and what voices mean to us as listeners and how they affect us. So thinking about the kinds of information that you would think of as the voice as a social signal, we might think that when you hear a voice, and this should say first impressions actually, you get a first impression. You hear a voice, from the get-go, you get some sense of, does this person sound authoritative? Do they sound friendly? Do they sound happy, sad, those kinds of things? And there has been some empirical work on this. So Phil McAleer up in Glasgow ran a study published in 2014 where he simply recorded 64 individuals reading out a script, and from that script he extracted the token hello, just one instance of hello from 64 people. And then he got a bunch of listeners who were naive to the identities of these people to rate them on about 10 different traits. So things like confidence and dominance, and likability and trustworthiness and attractiveness and things like that. So I'll get you to have a go at this now, and hopefully these sounds will work. So I'm going to play you a pair of female voices saying hello, and I just want you to have a think about which one you think sounds more trustworthy.
Hello. Hello.
So who thought the first one sounded more trustworthy? Yeah. Second one? Yeah. So you agree with the participants in this study. Let's have a go at this. Another pair now of male voices.
Hello. Hello.
First voice more trustworthy? Second voice more trustworthy? Okay. So basically, what I just played you, you responded in great numbers to what the raters in this experiment said. So I believe it was the second female voice was more trustworthy, and I can't remember, but the hello one was more trustworthy than the hello. And there was very high agreement across all the raters in the experiment. So they all were able to make an agreed first impression about this voice. And the details of this figure aren't necessarily so important, but on all these different traits, they tried to reduce the data that they got into a couple of underlying parameters that would describe how voices varied in sort of trait space. And what they found was that there was one axis that generally represented likability or trustworthiness, and one axis of variation that represented dominance in the voice. And this aligned quite nicely with the face literature, which had already published on this, showing that you can, even from like about 100 milliseconds of a face flashed on the screen, you can extract quite a lot of information about your perceived, their perceived traits, and there's good agreement across lots of different raters in that. So that's all well and good. So if you have a voice, then you can have a voice that sounds trustworthy, you can have a voice that sounds dominant from even just one word. But of course, we don't just say hello to people and walk away and disappear. We have interactions with other people, and so we might be more interested in how do you take a first impression and make a lasting impression. And so there are some people that are now beginning to go about this, and I should say I'm referring to studies here that didn't happen in my lab, but are points of sort of thought that have led to some things that we're working on now. And this is a study that was run at Plymouth University as part of a PhD project. And this was saying, well, okay, let's take voices, but let's actually now give them a personality through how they act in a game scenario and see how that affects people's responses to them. So they had this game where people would play several rounds with a voice agent that they were led to believe was human, but they just heard recordings of that person saying statements in every round of the game. And the participant, the human participant, on every round was given £8, and they were told, okay, you can put some of this £8 as an investment to the other player. And when that investment arrives with them, they're actually going to get 3 times the amount of that investment, and then that player is going to be able to decide whether they're going to give you a portion of that money back. So this goes on for 20 rounds in this case. So they could then model the behavior of the agent that was only represented by a voice to be generous or to be a bit mean. So the generous player could give back 120 to 240% of the original investment, or they could give back nothing up to maybe something around equivalent of the original investment. So over many rounds, you build up a relationship with that voice because you think it's either a generous voice, it keeps giving you back lots of money, or one that's a bit mean. So I'm just showing you a figure here of the overall pattern that they got in their study. So now this is contrasting in green, the upper line there, the generous voices, and in orange, the mean voices. And then the turns of the game are going on the x-axis, so this is progression in time through the game. And on the y-axis is the investment in pounds. So what you can see quite simply here is that if a vocal agent is giving you lots of money back, you start to invest more and more in it, and then you kind of reach a kind of high level of investment. Whereas if it's mean and it's not giving you much back, you, on the later turns, invest less. But what was interesting about this work, and they had multiple studies where they looked at this, was that not all voices are created equal in the sense that some voices from the first round sound a little bit more appealing than other voices. So let's now break down generous and mean into different voices that behaved in this way. So this figure shows you the pattern over a group of participants of their investments in two different voices that were both acting equally generously. But the voice in green, from the start, you can see there, started with a slightly higher investment in round one. That was the more favored voice. And if that voice continued to behave nicely, it continued to be more favored throughout the experiment. It was getting more investments, even though it was doing the same thing, okay? Now, what about mean voices? So now let's consider these two voices, but now behaving in a mean way. And what you find here is really interesting, because again, the initially more favored voice that got the biggest investments on average in the first round, if it started behaving meanly, was punished for that. It was punished more severely for behaving meanly than the voice that started off being less attractive to begin with. So this is a really interesting predicament, because you can have a voice that objectively people would say, well, subjectively actually, people would say this sounds trustworthy, this sounds more likable, and so on. But if it makes a mistake, it might be more harshly punished for it than one that sounded a little bit more neutral to you to start with. So this is really interesting for us to think about how behavior of a vocal agent might actually affect your responses to the sound of that vocal agent. And where this is all leading for me in my current project is that I'm interested in trying to find some evidence for a biological basis to this really, really well-known phrase. It's so good to hear your voice. So good to hear your voice. You pick up the phone to your mum and you've not spoken to her in 2 weeks, you've been away, and it's so nice to hear her voice. But there's really only a limited literature on whether or not that has an actual biological basis. Does it feel nice to hear my mum's voice, or is it just something I say? And I'm just going to tell you an anecdote, which is, I think, quite a nice illustration of this. So this is probably a sound you recognize.
Mind the gap.
Okay. So this is a recording of a man who was the voice of Mind the Gap on the Northern Line at Charing Cross Station for many, many, many years. His name's Oswald Lawrence. He was an actor, and he's died now, and he's no longer with us. And after he died, a few years after he died, they changed up the voice. They put a new voice on that platform. And they received communication from his wife, because his wife had been visiting the platform for years after he died just to hear his voice saying, mind the gap. Now, mind the gap to you and me is just mind the gap, right? Stop off the train, we're annoyed, people are in the way. But to her, it was the symbol of a lost loved one. Hearing his voice meant something really real to her. And the nice ending to this story is they put his voice back. So if you go there now, you can hear Oswald Lawrence. And now you know the story, so it touches you in a different way too. But when does a learned voice, so I can learn an association with a voice, I can be trained in a lab to recognize a voice, right? This is person A and not person B or C. But when does a learned voice become a personally familiar voice, when my relationship with that voice develops? How does this happen? How long does it take? What kinds of experiences do I have to have with a voice before it becomes a voice that I know and love and is represented in my sort of mental world as a voice that is really important to me? And what is the value of a personally familiar voice? So one thing that we're looking at now is developing a series of studies to actually, at the end, think about, can we actually show empirically that the voice is rewarding? Is receiving a message from a loved voice the same as receiving money or food or other things that have been defined to be rewarding in the brain? They activate centers in the brain that are associated with reward. So just to highlight the research program that we're setting out on at the moment. So we're just a few months into a new 5-year program. It's called Sonovox, which stands for Social Neuroscience of Voices. But what we're trying to do is kind of walk through this path of thinking about how voices work and how we perceive them and also how we produce them. So one thing that we do need to know a lot more about actually is some of the basics of how we recognize other voices. What are the limits of our skills in recognizing other voices? Can I recognize, an actor that I've never heard laugh before when I hear them laughing out of context? Possibly not. Some of the evidence suggests that this highly variable, highly dynamic quality of the voice means that you need a lot of exposure and a lot of practice before you can recognize someone no matter what you hear. So that kind of basic research is important to us, but where we're taking that is to the meaning of other voices, so answering these questions about what it means to hear a voice that you can attribute certain personality traits to, that you've had certain experiences with, that you have grown up with and you love because you know the person that goes with that voice. And also to think about that in more naturalistic contexts like conversations. And then just to mirror this, we're also interested in that from the expression point of view. So how do we express traits in our own voice? What does it mean to own a voice? For me, is it important to me how my voice sounds and it belongs to me and so on? So these are things that I thought, from my perspective, I'm curious about in terms of the work that you do. So, when you have a vocal agent, does it need to sound a certain way? Does it need to sound attractive? Does it need to sound trustworthy? All these first impressions we talked about. Does it need to sound competent, depending on what you need that agent to do or seem that it can do? Does it need to sound happy, or does it need to sound calm? And then these are the questions that really kind of fascinate me, and I would like to know more from you. Does a voice need to sound, does it need to become something that seems familiar to you? Does it need to become part of your home life, for example? The voice that you trust, the voice that you know, that you've built a relationship with. Does it even need to sound human, however? Does it matter if something can sound empathic with the things that it says, but it maybe still sounds robotic or unnatural? And how do these things interact with the behavior of the agent? What happens when expectations are violated? Can you think about ways in which you might design your agent that it's a bit more robust to errors of competence? But what if you need it to be social? If you need it to be social, then maybe the needs of the voice and how it sounds to start with are different. And I just wondered, are there ways that we can set up paradigms such as game playing or such as these kind of structured interactions where we can actually quantify the progression from I've just encountered this thing for the first time to now actually I've established a belief about the personality that goes with this voice. So just to point out, I've got 2 of my researchers in the lab are with me tonight, so for afterwards if you're chatting and wanting to ask some more questions about this, Nadine and Sarah are here. So thank them for coming along if you do have questions about the kind of thing that we do. And also shamelessly plugging an eye tracking training course that's happening at our department soon, which might be of interest to some of you. So we have some excellent facilities and training opportunities for people who are interested in where people's eyes move when they look at certain things, which might be of interest to some of you there. But that's all I wanted to say, so thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Straight there.
Sorry. I had a thought about uncanny valley. Is there any kind of situation where the voice can be too human, where it becomes? Do you know what I mean?
This is a totally fascinating question, and actually, since I knew I was coming to speak here, I've had a couple of people mention this to me from your perspective, saying, is there such a thing? And I think probably not yet, because I think that possibly you need that combination of an interaction that feels really realistic as well as a signal that sounds really realistic. So I don't know if it would come across as uncanny. I mean, there are probably ways in which you could try and probe that experimentally in terms of people's explicit evaluations of voices. But then their implicit behavior with a voice might not reflect any unease. I think these can be separable things. But I think it's a really interesting question about where will vocal interactions go to, where it then becomes that if it sounds really human and it behaves in a really human way, you start to get freaked out, and maybe then you want it to sound like a robot again, actually.
Any more? Question over here?
I don't know if this microphone works. But yeah, one element that I'm fascinated by is things like accent and sort of the cultural stuff of dialect or anything like that. How do you make sure that doesn't become another sort of parameter in what you're looking at that affects things like
Yeah.
trust, because obviously advertisers are famous for using certain dialects to transmit levels of trust.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question. Some people are interested in how accent can convey different types of impression. And actually this study, they were looking at different accents that I showed you, the one with the game, but they were looking at accents, but actually they were looking at individual voices that happened to have those accents. And actually it wasn't consistent that like the Birmingham accent, you know, connoted a certain level of trait versus, you know, another accent that happened to be from, or another voice that happened to be from Birmingham. I wonder if, for example, you might be able to play on people's first impressions, their sort of historical impressions of what accents were, and I find that, I don't like it, I don't like the idea, but then if it's something you need to do that makes it work, then fine, but then I think it depends on this transition between how a voice gives you a first impression and how that voice then operates to lead to a lasting impression that actually works for what you need. I think it's like the model that the previous speaker presented, like what's my need at the end of this? How do I start out and how do I get there? And I think that the progression of the discussion, like there's no point if someone sounds really trustworthy because they sound Glaswegian, but then they make loads of errors or they say something a bit funny and you think, oh, actually, then you've lost already. So, but I think it does come into it sort of with regret, right? You know, I mean, it's not nice to think that different accents have a sort of baggage with them that seems to connote different types of positive or negative, unfortunately, traits.
Okay, please join me in saying thank you one more time.